Foreign Minister cancels her visit to Myanmar as anti-coup demonstrations continue. An investigation underway after two elderly residents received the wrong doses of the COVID vaccine, while leaked documents reveal flaws in PNG's quarantine system. And Tiger Woods awake and recovering after his car rolls off a Los Angeles highway. You're watching The World. Also tonight, a minister for loneliness to counter a surge in isolation in Japan. Well, pressure is mounting on ASEAN countries who are yet to provide a unified response to the coup in Myanmar. The country's military-appointed foreign minister has arrived in Thailand ahead of talks to try and find a solution to the growing anger within Myanmar and abroad. Indonesia's Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi was also due to travel there to speak to the country's military. That visit has now been scrapped, with the ministry saying now is not the right time.
Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia left open an option to visit Naypyidaw to work on solution at the regional level and disrespect ASEAN, where the development of situation in Myanmar is taken into consideration. After taking into account the current development and following the consultation with a number of other ASEAN countries, this is not the ideal time to conduct a visit to Myanmar. Indonesia is also committed to pursuing communication with all parties in Myanmar.
Meanwhile, demonstrations against the military coup have continued. Thousands of protesters have again defied the junta to denounce the takeover and are calling for the release of deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Protesters in Yangon held banners calling for Indonesia not to support a dictatorship, while in Mandalay, armed police blocked the path of thousands of anti-coup demonstrators. Even elephants joined the march in a nearby village. And we'll have more on ASEAN's response to the Myanmar coup with analyst Aaron Connolly a little later in the program. Well, a major investigation is underway after two elderly residents at a Queensland aged care home were accidentally given an excessive amount of the COVID-19 Pfizer vaccine. It's been revealed the doctor who administered the drug had not completed the required training. He's been reported to the medical regulator while the patients are being monitored for any side effects. Lily Nuthling reports.
A serious breach by an untrained doctor just days into Australia's vaccine rollout. Two Brisbane aged care residents aged 88 and 94 were yesterday injected with up to 4 times the recommended dose of the Pfizer vaccine.
The doctor involved did the wrong thing, and that is a case of human error, a case of unacceptable human error. And so as a consequence of that, the doctor was stood down.
A nurse stepped in to intervene. The elderly man and woman are being monitored in hospital and so far are showing no side effects.
This incident's been very distressing to us, to our residents and to their family, and it's also very concerning. It's caused us to question whether some of the clinicians given the job of administering the vaccine have received the appropriate training.
The GP in question hadn't.
On further investigation, Healthcare Australia has now advised that the doctor had not completed the required training.
None of this is good enough and the federal government must explain itself. Today I will write to the Prime Minister asking him to convene a national cabinet as soon as possible.
The Federal Health Minister is demanding action against the GP and the contracted provider, Healthcare Australia. The doctor has been referred to the medical regulator and an investigation is now underway into how he showed up to work without the necessary qualifications. In December, 8 people in Germany were accidentally given 5 times the normal dose when a health worker gave them the entire vial each. Some had flu-like symptoms, while others showed no sign of a reaction. Pfizer says it experimented with higher doses of the vaccine during its research without serious side effects. Brisbane's second vaccination hub opened today. Health authorities eager to assure the public the jab is safe.
We'd be well aware that these are multi-dose vials. We have systems in place, a dedicated team. We don't believe there's any risk of an overdose occurring.
Our confidence in vaccination hasn't been rocked by this at all. We're just wanting to reassure the process doesn't allow an error like this to ever happen again.
Lily Nothling, ABC News, Brisbane.
Meanwhile, there are concerns that Papua New Guinea might not be able to deal with a serious COVID outbreak after revelations of flaws in its quarantine system. Leaked documents obtained by the ABC reveal ministers have been granting unauthorised exemptions. The country's pandemic control centre is also at risk of collapse because key staff have not been paid. Here's PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting.
The message is clear, but it's not getting through to everyone. A leaked document obtained by the ABC has revealed major holes in Papua New Guinea's COVID-19 control system. The ministerial briefing says staff managing quarantine at the airport don't have police or security support to enforce the rules, and some government ministers have been providing unauthorised exemptions.
We're going to take it very seriously now, so if anybody is caught breaking the law, the consequences are going to be very high.
The briefing also warns critical functions at the National Control Centre for COVID-19 are at risk of collapsing because some staff aren't being paid.
We're working through that now. The Secretary's been tasked to make sure and ensure that the people that are working in the front line get paid.
PNG has so far recorded just over 1,100 COVID-19 cases and 10 deaths. But the testing rate is low, so the real figure could be much higher. The leaked documents reveal some provinces in the country haven't been submitting any coronavirus testing results, and a recent spike in cases is worrying authorities. This field hospital in the capital was closed last year when cases dropped, but it's now being reopened. Authorities say it is urgently needed, with isolation wards at 2 hospitals now full.
When you're not seeing as many severe cases, it's human nature to become a little more complacent, and that's a real challenge to address.
They have a smaller one.
It will be at least 2 months before vaccinations arrive in PNG.
We've got to remain vigilant.
A further spike before then could be devastating. Natalie Whiting, ABC News, Port Moresby.
Well, the World Health Organization has delivered its first COVAX COVID-19 vaccines to Ghana. A flight carrying 600,000 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine landed in the capital, Accra. The delivery comes 8 months after the launch of the WHO's global vaccine sharing program. It aims to pool funds from wealthier countries and charities to develop and distribute vaccines to the world's poorest. Indian climate activist Disha Ravi has been granted bail by an India court. The 22-year-old was arrested for sedition over the creation of an online document to help protesting farmers. A judge told a packed courtroom he could not find a palpable reason to keep Ms Ravi in custody. Her bail was set at $3,500. Tens of thousands of farmers have been camped out in the outskirts of New Delhi since December, protesting against the country's new agricultural laws. Well, the attack on the US Capitol by Trump supporters is back in the spotlight after top security officials gave first public testimony on the assault. Former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sunt blamed intelligence failures for the time it took to call in the National Guard. He said his officers lacked training and equipment and didn't see an FBI memo that warned extremists could bring war to Washington. 5 people were killed in the riot.
Of the multitude of events I've worked in my nearly 19-year career in the department, this was by far the worst of the worst. We could have had 10 times the amount of people working with us, and I still believe the battle would have been just as devastating.
3 of the 4 officials testifying before the Senate panels resigned in the wake of the attack. Pentagon officials will give their version of events at a second hearing next week. The golf superstar Tiger Woods is awake and recovering in hospital tonight after his car rolled off a highway in Los Angeles. His staff have just tweeted that he's responsive after a long surgical procedure to treat multiple leg injuries. Police say he is lucky to have survived. Fans, though, are worried that it could threaten his planned return to the course.
Tiger Woods was the only person in this car when it veered off a Los Angeles highway and crashed. It was just after 7 o'clock in the morning, and it didn't take long for police to realise who it was.
I asked him what his name was. He told me his name was Tiger, and at that moment I immediately recognised him.
Woods had to be carried out of the wreck. He was taken to hospital in a serious condition with 2 fractured legs and a shattered ankle. A lucky man, despite his injuries.
It's very fortunate that Mr. Woods was able to come out of this alive.
Woods has undergone surgery for his injuries. Authorities say there were no signs of Woods being impaired by drugs or alcohol, but he did appear to be driving faster than normal.
Apparently the first contact was with the center median, and from there then crossed into the opposing lane of traffic, hit the curb, hit a tree, and there was several rollovers during that process.
The accident a major shock for people across the sporting world.
Man, I just hope he's all right. Just worry for his kids, you know. I'm sure they're struggling.
Few have ever been associated more with their sport than Woods.
The return to glory.
The youth prodigy smashed golf's racial barriers in the 1990s to become one of the biggest stars on earth, through on-course highs as well as some off-course personal failings. The 45-year-old hasn't played since December due to back surgery. Fans the world over are now hoping he can overcome yet another challenge. NEWSThe, ABC News.
Well, let's return to our top story. And ASEAN remains under pressure to reach a united front on the coup in Myanmar. Earlier today, Indonesia's Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi confirmed she would not travel to Myanmar for scheduled talks with the country's military leaders. Aaron Connolly is a research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He says he's unsure if Ms Marsudi's visit would have made a difference.
Well, Retno Marsudi, the Indonesian foreign minister, has said that she had been continuing her consultations with both ASEAN member states and then also with outside powers like the US, Europe. But I'm not sure how much mediation there actually was that she could have done in Naypyidaw. We don't know what Aung San Suu Kyi thinks about all this because she's been detained incommunicado. But before she was detained, she was not in the mood to compromise. She firmly felt that she was in the right, and the military doesn't appear ready to give up power anytime soon, which is what the protesters in the streets are demanding. So I'm not sure that there was much constructive mediation to be done in Naypyidaw to begin with.
Indonesia had indicated that they supported fresh elections being held. Was that ignoring the way the last election had been overthrown?
The Indonesian position is a little bit unclear. On the day of the coup, they issued a statement that most interpreted, and Indonesian diplomats I spoke with said, was calling for a return to the status quo on January 31st, this sort of strange partial democracy that Myanmar had before the coup. There was a statement by the Indonesian foreign ministry spokesman yesterday that suggested that they weren't actually calling for fresh elections. And I think their position perhaps hadn't been solidified before Retno Marsudi made plans to travel to Naypyidaw. So I think it's still a little bit unclear as to what they were arguing for.
Yeah, Malaysia too sending mixed signals. The court had said that 1,200 Myanmar nationals should not be sent back because they were concerned for their safety. Yet the Malaysian government defied that order and sent them back. Were you surprised that they did that?
No, I think this is a sign of disagreements within the Malaysian government. Particularly over the very large number of undocumented Myanmar immigrants in Malaysia, around 1 million undocumented immigrants in Malaysia. There are parts of the Malaysian government, the foreign ministry in particular, that are very seized with the problem of the coup and the crisis in Myanmar. And there are other parts of the Malaysian government that are much more focused on domestic politics and a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment that we have seen really spike during COVID in Malaysia. And so I think it was, a case of one hand not really knowing what the other was doing. And it appears that the asylum seekers and other immigrants, undocumented immigrants, were loaded onto the Myanmar Navy ships before the court handed down its order or shortly after.
So it was maybe a question of bad timing. But it does give you an indication there. You've got two key ASEAN nations and a kind of discord or perhaps not clear understanding of the way forward on how to engage with Myanmar. Yeah, apologies for that. We have a few technical issues there, talking there to Aaron Connolly. Well, former Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins has formally made a criminal complaint against the man she claims raped her inside Parliament House. Ms Higgins gave a statement to federal police this afternoon, 2 years after the alleged attack. It capped off a dramatic day in federal politics, which began with Ms Higgins' former boss being admitted to hospital. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Reynolds and her... No one can doubt the intense strain the Defence Minister has been under.
If I could ask Mr President, if I could have indulgence, if you can just give me a minute. Or can I take it on notice?
Yep. Linda Reynolds visibly distraught last week as pressure mounted over her handling of Brittany Higgins' claim she was raped by a colleague in the Minister's office.
Linda was desperate to appear before the National Press Club today.
Today at the National Press Club, Defence Minister Linda Reynolds.
But the Minister declared herself a no-show, releasing a statement revealing she'd be taking a period of medical leave following advice from her cardiologist about a pre-existing medical condition. Admitted to a Canberra hospital as a precautionary measure, the Minister said the Prime Minister had called her to express his concern and sympathy and to wish her a quick recovery. The ABC understands Scott Morrison also spoke to Senator Reynolds' cardiologist, apparently to better understand her condition.
She's a good person, and so she needs our support, and she has our support.
Senator Reynolds has felt the PM's ire for not telling him earlier of Ms Higgins' alleged rape 2 years ago.
The only minister who had knowledge of an alleged sexual assault in relation to this matter was Minister Reynolds.
But it turns out Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton also knew about it the week before the Prime Minister, informed by the Federal Police Commissioner Rhys Kershaw.
I was advised on the 11th of February.
And the PM staff claim they didn't know until the day after that, February 12, although that's being investigated.
Why doesn't the Prime Minister just ask his staff and then tell the Parliament?
I have asked the department to provide further advice to assure me about the credibility of what I was told by my staff.
Brittany Higgins made a formal complaint to the Federal Police this afternoon, which will likely trigger a criminal investigation. But with at least 3 ministers aware of her alleged sexual assault before it went public, why no one told the Prime Minister still hasn't been properly explained, especially when the alleged perpetrator was, until last year, on a register of people who lobby federal politicians. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Several countries have moved to ground all Boeing 777s with the same engine that blew up after takeoff in America on the weekend. Investigators say the 26-year-old engine that failed on the United Airlines flight had damage consistent with metal fatigue. The plane landed safely with over 240 people on board. The 777 model in question has been pulled from service by airlines in the US, Japan and South Korea. They've also been banned from entering UK airspace. Part of a cemetery in the Italian Riviera has collapsed into the sea, sending 200 coffins down a cliff. An operation is underway to recover them. So far, only a handful have been pulled from the water. Workers have been trying to stabilise a cliff face damaged in coastal storms over the past few years. Well, the vaccine rollout across Asia and the Pacific is underway, albeit at a much slower pace than in North America and Europe. Nations here which don't have high COVID numbers aren't in as much of a rush. Also, less wealthy nations are having to rely on the global COVAX program or donations to implement their programs. Here's Yvonne Young.
We're about a year into the pandemic and vaccines are already being rolled out in no fewer than 80 countries. But it's been at a slower pace than expected.
So far, 210 million doses of vaccine have been administered globally. But half of those are in just 2 countries, and 80% are in just 10 countries. More than 200 countries are yet to administer a single dose.
Compared to North America and Europe, Asia and the Pacific is seeing fewer than 2 doses administered per 100 people, led by India, Indonesia, China and Singapore. Limited vaccine supply, logistics and lack of funding are among the challenges. particularly in developing economies where existing immunisation programs may not be ready for these new vaccines. Pacific countries have to largely rely on the COVAX initiative, which delivers vaccines to less developed nations. Through this platform, the WHO has just approved the AstraZeneca vaccine for use in Vanuatu and others in the region. Of course, for countries such as Australia and New Zealand, where COVID numbers have been relatively low, there's not been as much of an urgency to get everyone vaccinated. In China, millions have already been inoculated, some under an emergency program, and all with home-developed vaccines. However, Hong Kong residents will soon have a choice of the Pfizer vaccine too. Chinese vaccines have also been approved for use in other countries, including Indonesia, Cambodia and Pakistan. The Indian drug can be used in more than a handful of neighbouring economies. Globally, by far the most widely used is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, approved in more than 50 countries, including here in Australia, New Zealand and Singapore. The Oxford, AstraZeneca and the Moderna vaccines are not far behind. These are just some of the countries across the region where its use has been approved.
Well, it's a case of here we go again in Israel. Next month, the country will hold its fourth parliamentary election in 2 years and its second since the coronavirus pandemic began. The vote has been brought on prematurely because of a seemingly endless political stalemate between longtime Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his centrist coalition partner Benny Gantz. Let's go live to Jerusalem. I'm joined by the Washington Institute's Ehud Yari. He's also a frequent visiting expert for the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Ehud, lovely to see you and talk to you again. Now,
good evening.
Fourth election, has any of the constant deadlock between these two parties been resolved? Has the dynamic changed since the last election?
I think that the dynamic has changed mainly because Mr. Gantz, the alternative Prime Minister who was supposed to take Mr. Netanyahu's place as Prime Minister in November, is no longer a serious player. He would be lucky to cross the threshold of 3.25% in order to have 4 members of parliament. He's no longer in the race. Between the blocks, between the right-wing bloc headed by Bibi and the center left bloc, it's a sort of a tie. According to the polls, all the polls, by the way, not one of these, none of the blocks can reach the magic number of 61 out of 120. So a fifth election, that may happen.
That is disturbing to think about. But of course, Gantz's support fell off because he went into a coalition with Netanyahu. How has COVID played into Netanyahu's popularity?
There are 2 sides to this coin. On the one hand, I would say the majority of the people think that the government was too busy with political bickering between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gantz and the ultra-religious parties, etc., so that the pandemic was not managed properly, although at the first phase, Israel was far ahead. That's one side of the coin. A lot of criticism of Bibi and the government altogether. The second side of the coin is the success of Israel, again credited to Mr. Netanyahu, in bringing here millions and millions of vaccines. We have about 5 million people already vaccinated, including the fellow you are interviewing, 2 jabs. And the pandemic seems to be, I'm saying it carefully, receding. This may play for Mr. Netanyahu.
You're talking about the deadlock again in these 2 blocks, but an unlikely partner has emerged. Tell us about Mansour Abbas and how he could end up being quite a significant political player.
That's very interesting. Thank you for the question. Mr. Mansour Abbas is leader of the Islamic movement of the Israeli Arabs. And he is saying to his former partners in the joint Arab list, which included 4 different Arab parties, he's saying to them, enough is enough. we need to get something for our voters. And basically he's saying, for the right price, in terms of an economic program for the Arab sector, other benefits, etc., I am willing to be in government with Mr. Netanyahu. That's the first time it happens in Israeli politics. And of course, Bibi, the shrewd politician, is cultivating it. And he's now courting the Arab vote.
Which is remarkable, but what might that then mean for policy, and could that be quite a positive step forward?
I think that an Arab party, or even all of them, joining or supporting a coalition, whether it's Mr. Netanyahu or his rivals, would be a very positive development in Israel. What you saw in Israel was that the Arab public, the Israeli citizens of Arab origin, over 1 million people, felt that their leadership was too busy with the issue of a Palestinian state, PLO, yes or no, and not taking care of their own issues. For example, there is a big problem of rising crime in the Arab sector. So the Arab voters are saying to their own leaders, that's it. Let's start taking care of our own problems, and the Palestinians will do whatever is best for them. So you have this almost unbelievable situation in which Mr. Netanyahu is saying, I will have an Arab minister, I will be an ally of the Islamic movement, which was almost outlawed a few years ago. Things are happening here.
Remarkable.
Very dynamic place.
It is very interesting. Tell me too, I mean, you know, we talk about Netanyahu, who has been the ultimate political survivor. His corruption charges were yet again delayed because of the election. Do you think he's going to potentially dodge them altogether if he successfully pulls together a coalition?
He's in a more comfortable situation now, because the 3 judges, the District Court of Jerusalem, have decided to start hearing the prosecution witnesses only after the elections. That means there will be nobody on the stand for the press to cover with all sorts of stories and charges against Mr. Netanyahu. However, if he manages to form a government, which is 50-50 now, he may try to postpone the trial altogether until after his term is over. He may try to fire the Attorney General, and he may try to advance serious reforms in the judicial system. He doesn't talk much about it, but it's there.
Yes, always working in the background. Ehud, great to talk. We'll talk again, no doubt, before the election. Thank you.
Good night.
Buckingham Palace has revealed Prince Philip has an infection and will remain in hospital for several more days. Europe correspondent Nick Dole has more from London.
Buckingham Palace says that the Duke of Edinburgh will stay in hospital for several more days at least. It was a week ago that the 99-year-old was admitted to the King Edward VII Hospital here in London. We're told that he walked in himself for a period of observation, but he hasn't emerged. And initially there was no detail given about the nature of his illness. Buckingham Palace now says it is an infection, but it says that he is comfortable and is responding to treatment. Over the weekend, his son, Prince Charles, travelled from Gloucestershire to London to visit him, and that prompted some speculation that perhaps the Duke of Edinburgh's condition may be worsening. But today, his youngest son, Prince Edward, said his father is doing well.
As far as I'm aware, well, I did speak to him the other day, so he's a lot better, thank you very much indeed, and he's looking forward to getting out, which is the most positive thing. So we keep our fingers crossed.
Now, the Duke has previously been in hospital for similar ailments, including infections, and he's pulled through, but obviously his age is a factor here. The Duke turns 100 in June, so Prince Edward says all the members of the royal family are crossing their fingers for him. Both the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen have had COVID vaccinations, but the Queen has remained at Windsor Castle throughout this health scare, and she is likely to remain there as long as the lockdown here continues.
British naturalist David Attenborough has warned the United Nations that climate change is the biggest security threat modern humans have faced. The 94-year-old issued the warning over a virtual meeting with the UN climate panel. A summit is planned for later this year and it's billed as the most important since the 2015 Paris Accord. Berlin Zoo is celebrating the birth of a baby gorilla. It's the first born there in about 16 years. Neither keepers nor veterinarians have approached the new family, so the sex and weight of the new arrival is unknown. To what in the world, and road users in China have been surprised by an unlikely traveller joining the morning commute. A 2-metre-tall ostrich was seen on dashboard and traffic cameras making its way through a southern Chinese city. Eventually, its owners caught up to the feathered fugitive, covering its head with a cloth before guiding it home. He said the animal made a break for it after he opened a gate at his farm, and it seems there was little chance the bird fell foul of any of the traffic rules during his brief taste of life on the open road. You're watching The World. Our top stories tonight: Indonesia's Foreign Minister scraps her visit to Myanmar as anti-coup protests continue across the country. The doctor who administered an overdose of the Pfizer vaccine to 2 aged care residents in Queensland had not completed the required vaccination training. And the family of golfer Tiger Woods says he's awake and responsive after surgery on serious leg injuries that he suffered in a car crash in Los Angeles. A German court has handed down a guilty verdict in a landmark Syrian torture trial. Former member of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's secret police, Ayad al-Ghahib, was convicted of facilitating the torture of prisoners and sentenced to 4.5 years in jail. It's the first such verdict for crimes against humanity in the 10-year-old Syrian civil war, and gives hope to the 800,000 Syrians in Germany who say they were tortured in government facilities. South Korea has received its first delivery of COVID-19 vaccines. Dozens of the AstraZeneca vaccine produced on consignment by a local firm have been transported from a factory in Andong to a hub in Incheon. From there, the vaccines will be distributed to community health centres and nursing hospitals ahead of the first inoculations on Friday. The country is also expecting to receive Pfizer vaccines by the end of the week. Meanwhile, a first batch of 200,000 doses of China's Sinovac shots have arrived in Thailand. The AstraZeneca vaccine is also being delivered here. Thailand hopes to inject 10 million doses a month from June. Queensland is closing its borders to New Zealand from tonight after new cases of community transmission. Green flights into Queensland from New Zealand will stop from 6 o'clock tonight, meaning travellers entering the Sunshine State will need to quarantine. Chief Health Officer Dr Jeanette Young says the border closure is needed after a recent increase in locally acquired COVID cases across the Tasman. Anyone who has arrived in Queensland from New Zealand since the 6th of February is urged to come forward, get tested and isolate until they have a negative result. Well, almost a year since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, there are still tens of thousands of Australians trying to return home from overseas. People who are stuck across South America are finding it especially difficult to get back. But a team of travel agents in New Zealand has come to the rescue of one group of Aussies who arrived today. Here's Jade McMillan.
Exhausted but happy to finally be home.
Very good, thank you.
Around 120 Australians touched down in Sydney after a charter flight from Chile's capital, Santiago. Luz Thomas made her own trip from Melbourne, desperate to catch a glimpse of her mother, who's been stranded in Peru.
She went over there because my grandmother passed away. So, and then since then she's been stuck.
The flight was organised by a small team of travel agents in New Zealand who worked day and night to make it happen.
We underwrote the cost of this flight $500,000, which was particularly scary. It's a big risk to take, but we knew that the demand was there.
State arrivals caps are limiting the number of returnees each week, but Australians stuck in South American countries say they've been further hampered by internal border closures and a lack of flight options.
It was really stressful for me, getting cancelled all the time, packing my bags.
Annalisa Powell and her partner recently made it home to Perth from Brazil, just weeks before she's due to give birth.
That was really important for me, to be in a place that's safer and closer to my family.
There are still around 40,000 Australians registered as wanting to return home, and around 1,000 of them are believed to be in South America. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade says it's assisted with hundreds of flights from around the world, and that its top priority is helping people who are vulnerable. Jade McMillan, ABC News, Canberra.
The World Bank has threatened to pull funding for Lebanon's coronavirus vaccination program, accusing parliamentarians of jumping the queue. The bank had approved almost $50 million to fund Lebanon's vaccination program for 2 million people. At least 16 MPs are reported to have jumped the queue, where health workers and people over 75 are supposed to be given priority. Corruption and nepotism are rife in Lebanon, which has registered more than 356,000 cases and almost 4,400 deaths in the pandemic. Now to an issue that's as confronting as it is important. In Japan, the pandemic has exacerbated the long-standing taboo of mental health and suicide. In October last year, more people died from suicide in Japan than COVID-19, and women were overrepresented in that grim statistic. Now, a Minister for Loneliness has been appointed to combat the growing problem of social isolation. I'm joined by Melanie Brock, long-time Tokyo resident, consultant and founder of a website that profiles prominent Japanese women. And before we start our conversation, I should warn you that we'll delve quite deeply into suicide and depression. And if you're going to find that troubling, I just wanted to let you know. Melanie, lovely to talk to you, but such a tricky topic, one that you've been immersed in for so many years. What is it about Japanese culture that increases the pressure on people?
I think, there are I'm not an expert in this particular field, but just watching the way that people have responded to this, I guess the issue is that there's already a lot of isolation. There's a huge amount of pressure in Japanese society. I think the burden of humiliation sometimes probably rings louder for people here than it might in Australia, for example. That sense of shame. Even one of the cases, and many cases, in fact, of the suicide have been where people have contracted COVID and are so embarrassed or so, I guess, humiliated. They're not able to talk to anybody about it, and then that just builds to be too big for them, and they've committed suicide, which is in itself such a tragic circumstance. But I guess it says a lot about the pressure that a lot of people feel. And that's particularly been, as you've said, felt by women.
What is it particularly, why is the issue so compounded for women?
Well, obviously it's a number of different issues. It's economic, in terms of a lot of Japanese women are working in irregular roles, I guess, whereby they're the first to have been, moved on. Restaurants, bars that have had to close, or their hours are restricted at the moment. So they're the first sort of, to be struck off the old sort of job list. So there's an economic issue that I think is very strong. There's the burden of childcare, of having to carry all of the COVID prevention sort of risks and management of all of that if they've got a family. I think for some women and men too, it's this sense that they're isolated, aren't able to go to work. That's not something that only Japanese are feeling, of course, but it's this humiliation or the shame that sometimes can prevail, meaning that it's tougher for people to sort of get over that. Mental health isn't talked about a lot. It's talked a lot more now than it was when I first came to Japan many years ago. But I think where you have a culture that allows for people to talk more about their issues, and in fact there are counsellors to see, that allows for people to sort of express themselves, and that doesn't happen as much as it might do in Australia, that's for sure.
So you're talking about the taboo of mental health more broadly sort of breaking down a little, but are there facilities, are there places where people can go to get support, even if it is privately?
I think there's much more, your friends might say now, why don't you go and get a counsellor? Whereas, years ago, that was taboo in itself. I was having dinner with a friend on Monday, and he is an employer, and he mentioned that 2 of his staff he had on suicide watch during this coronavirus. One was very, very against the idea of going to see a counsellor, but a younger worker said that they would. So I think it's showing that some of that stigma attached to sort of seeking help is breaking down, but it's still very, very sort of deep, and that makes it much harder. I think also this Japanese society means that sometimes it's difficult to tell people outside of your circle what you might actually be going through, and that's a giant generalisation, and I'm not Japanese, so I don't profess to obviously know that to the extent that Japanese might, but I think that puts a lot of pressure on people to be perfect and to do things the right way and to be seen to be doing the right way, and that sense of compliance creates that humiliation if things don't go well.
And again, that seems to be, I don't want to keep coming back to women only, but the statistics were really disproportionate for women. There was a 15% increase in suicide. Now, is it partly because the stereotypes of what women should be in Japanese culture don't seem to progress and change much?
I don't know if it's the stereotypes or if it's just the sheer pressure of COVID. Economic circumstances that mean that people don't have work, they can't pay their rent, they're too embarrassed perhaps to ask family for more support. We haven't had JobKeeper like Australia has, and I think that there's been a great deal of pressure on families to support people. So more than stereotypes, I think it might be economic, but also this incredible, just that pressure that and the chance not to be able to speak to your friends or to go to work and sort of just talk things through, even over a drink, for example, that's all just been taken away from people. And I think that isolation has really built.
So how do you think this Minister of loneliness is actually going to work? Will it have any real impact?
Well, you know, I mean, I know that the story has been picked up by the foreign press potentially more than it has by Japanese. The Japanese title, or rather the portfolio that this minister will take, is really attached to regional revitalisation, and that's a great need in Japan to get the regional areas of Japan moving along and bring about that sort of, you know, just giving people more opportunity through jobs and schooling, etc. But he's also going to be responsible for trying to keep the birth rate from delving into sort of really difficult area. Japan's population is expected to plummet. So that minister has that responsibility. And so I think when the government saw these figures, and I don't know if you've seen in Australia at least, but there was a record high number of of minors suicide in the last year. And that, I think, prompted the government to give consideration to looking at how that minister might handle this issue of social isolation. Now, look, it's very easy to say, you know, what can they do? But if empathy is part of that, I think we should all have a minister of social isolation and a minister for loneliness, because having just seen what's going on in Australia, I'm quite disturbed that we don't have enough empathy in terms of our own delivery. So we might not be able to stand on a soapbox and talk about what other countries should do. But for the fact that this ministry or this portfolio will probably have budget attached to it. And so let's hope that they are willing to discuss with people who are working in the field of suicide prevention and mental health, and that people together can work out what programs might support women, children and families in general.
Yeah, I think you're so right, and empathy is something that is in short supply in many parts of the world. Melanie, really lovely to talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, a reminder that if you or someone you know is experiencing distress, you can contact Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636 or Lifeline on 131114. Well, the African nation of Guinea has begun its Ebola vaccination campaign as authorities race to contain a resurgence in the virus. The vaccination rollout was launched in a rural community where the first cases were detected earlier this month. Health workers were among the first to receive the shot.
Everyone must come and get vaccinated because the government partners each and every one of us wants to help deal with this illness.
The country has recorded 4 confirmed and 4 probable cases and 5 deaths. It's the first known cases of Ebola since the 2013 outbreak that killed more than 11,000 people in Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone. Nepal's top court has ordered the reinstatement of Parliament, which was dissolved by the Prime Minister over squabbling within the ruling Communist Party. The Himalayan nation has been in political turmoil since Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli called a general election 18 months early. The decision is likely to result in a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister when Parliament resumes. Well, after a deal with Facebook, the federal government's controversial media bargaining code has passed the Senate. News hasn't returned to the social media platform yet, but the company says it will be back within days. Here's national technology reporter Michael Slezak.
After the public dust-up and tough talk...
This is Australia. You want to do business here? You work according to our rules.
They were heavy-handed.
Came the concessions.
We have announced some minor amendments, and Facebook has indicated that it will be restoring news to its Australian pages.
Media analysts are divided over who won.
I think Facebook overplayed its hand and they've climbed down significantly while trying to give the impression that they're not doing that.
This is a lose for absolutely everyone except, as usual, Rupert Murdoch.
Facebook says it got what it wanted, and the government will allow us to support the publishers we choose to, and that it will be able to decide what news appears on the platform, though that's always been the case. Crucially, the amendments say the minister must consider whether a digital platform like Facebook has cut enough deals with publishers before making the regulations apply to them. For Facebook, avoiding regulation is key, and it's moving quickly on deals that could exploit the loophole.
The owners of Channel 7, 7 West Media, have reached a historic deal with Facebook.
Where all this leaves small publishers is unclear.
The News Media Bargaining Code includes a mechanism for the digital platforms to make a default offer to smaller and regional players.
If Google and Facebook don't cut some significant deals with those rural, regional and local players, then the legislation will have failed in one of its main and, I would say, most important aims.
And some fear opportunities have been missed.
Who's to say that the platforms have any obligation to the news industry in Australia, which frankly, like that in America, just messed up on the internet and didn't have a strategy?
Facebook users can expect news back in their feeds within days. Michael Slezak, ABC News.
At least 62 people have died in riots in 3 Ecuadorian prisons. The government says simultaneous violence was the result of fights between rival criminal gangs and an escape attempt. The prison system is now in a temporary state of emergency, and an additional 800 police have been brought in to restore order. Well, 4 people have been charged in Australia and Canada, accused of trying to extort millions of dollars from a high-profile Iraqi politician. When their demands were ignored over the years, his family became the target of a series of attacks at their home in Western Sydney. Crime reporter Mark Reddy spoke exclusively to the daughter of Ahmed al-Assadi from a secret location.
A member of parliament in Iraq with a family in Western Sydney, but for 2 years their Chester Hill home has come under repeated attack. This fire 2 weeks ago forced them into hiding by police. Today the daughter of Ahmed al-Assadi spoke out from a secret location.
The safest place that a person has is their home, and that was the most dangerous for us for a while.
Today it became safer, with police arresting 2 men, much to the relief of her mother.
You could literally see the colour come back to her face. That's how relieved she was.
24-year-old Luminous Tuto and 22-year-old Zagalo Segura were handcuffed at Blacktown and Seven Hills. Detectives raided both their homes, seizing mobile phones and computers. And there was another breakthrough overseas.
In Canada, in Edmonton, they've arrested a 32-year-old female and a 34-year-old male who are going to be charged.
The 2 Canadians are accused of trying to extort $10 million from Mr al-Assadi. When the Iraqi MP didn't pay, they hired the 2 Sydney men to carry out attacks against his family. Among the worst, a shooting and a violent home invasion. Mr al-Assadi, his wife and children moved to Australia as refugees 20 years ago. He worked as a taxi driver here before eventually moving back home to become a local MP. Since then, his family has been living in fear. Having survived the Iraq War and the Saddam Hussein regime, the attacks in Australia first came as a surprise. Do you have any idea why someone would want to hurt your family?
No idea.
Mr al-Assadi was one of the faces of Iraq's government in its fight against Islamic State, and more recently has called for all foreign troops to leave the country.
We're very happy to finally be able to go home without having to worry about a potential attack or leaving the house and being paranoid.
Relief for a family who've escaped war and survived attacks linked to a global extortion ring. Mark Reddy, ABC News, Sydney.
Queensland's bid for the 2032 Olympics could soon take a major step forward. The